Good morning, everyone, and welcome to webinar 6 in the Early Intervention and Innovation Fund webinar series. My name is Joanne Ross. I'm a Senior Research and Evaluation Officer at the Centre for Alcohol and Other Drugs at the Ministry of Health, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing this webinar today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today. For me, here in St Leonards, that is the Gamma. We honour the ancestors of yesterday, the custodians of today, and those of tomorrow. We recognise the continuing connection to land and waters and how culture is held, nurtured and shared. We pay our respects and acknowledge any Aboriginal people joining us here today. This webinar is part of a series that is being run in partnership with NADA and New South Wales Health to promote the research findings of studies funded by New South Wales Health through the Early Intervention and Innovation Fund. Our presenter today is Dr. Kate Hall from Deakin University. Her biography is on the NADA website and her presentation is entitled Eric, Emotion Regulation and Impulse Control, a Sustainable Program for Vulnerable Young People with AOD and Mental Health Issues. Kate estimates her presentation will go for approximately 40 minutes, after which we'll have a Q&A session. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please post them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and get through as many of them as possible. I'm pleased to say that Kate will also be joined in the Q&A session by other members of the research team, Professor Adrian Dunlop from the Hunter New England Local Health District and Dr. Elise Sloan from Deakin University. Tanina Harvey, Acting Director from the Centre for Alcohol and Other Drugs at the Ministry, will also be available to join in the discussion. So without further delay, I'd like to invite Kate to start her presentation. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Jo. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for that welcome. I'm actually calling in from Yarraville in Melbourne, so I'd also like to pay my respects to elders of the people of the Kulin Nation down here in Victoria. We're going to speak to you today about a project that was run for 3.5 years throughout New South Wales in partnership with Hunter New England Local Health District and several others. And I'm joined by Elise Sloan, who was the project manager, and Adrian Dunlop, who was the chief investigator of the project. Perfect. So Eric is a program that was something came about through, a long-standing passion of mine of working with vulnerable young people who we may term complex or having multiple and complex needs. And we conducted this project with these partners in both the NGO and the LHD sectors. And I'd just also like to acknowledge our funders, which, as Jo said, was the Ministry of Health in New South Wales for the extent of the project. We had a lot of researchers working on this project. There's an acknowledgement of the team that worked over the 3.5 years, and we had collaborators at Newcastle Uni. Obviously, I'm from Deakin University, and other researchers throughout New South Wales. So, what is ERIC? I mean, many of you may have actually heard of ERIC if you were part of this project, but I thought I'd start with just a little introduction of the program itself. ERIC is transdiagnostic, which means it's one of those programs that is quite suitable for people with multiple challenges in their life, and it's not necessarily prescriptive about one presentation, such as one substance use issue or one mental health disorder. It's also modular, so it's flexible. It can be integrated by practitioners into their everyday usual practice. And we've run ERIC pilots with really broad ranging sectors, meaning we've worked with youth alcohol and drug sectors, primary mental health sectors, youth justice sectors, and the rolling sort of program of work that ERIC has been part of for the last maybe 5 or 6 years has not necessarily been attached to one particular sector. Our primary purpose of ERIC is to improve social and emotional outcomes for vulnerable young people. And we know that vulnerable young people access services in really a lot of different places, including education, justice, mental health, AOD, and many other areas. ERIC stands for Emotion Regulation and Impulse Control. And they're the transdiagnostic processes that ERIC really targets. And there's quite a lot of work that I guess has led to us, for us to sort of target emotion regulation specifically with vulnerable young people. And fundamentally, it's connected to the really high rates of early childhood trauma and disadvantage and the interruption that occurs through those early experiences of the systems that control emotions and the systems that help us regulate how we feel. And also help us develop through our young adulthood our mechanisms for controlling our urges and impulses. ERIC was developed through a 3-year partnership. It started in 2014 or 15. And that partnership was conducted with YSAS down here in Victoria, and it was a research to practice partnership. It wasn't just a co-design process that we undertook with ERIC. It was a process that really was something that drew upon the empirical literature. And that empirical literature was something that, Elise was a real driver of through her doctoral studies. We also looked at a lot of theoretical models of emotion regulation, and then we joined with our practitioners to try to integrate some of these scientific and theoretical principles with practice wisdom. We then brought that body of work to a group of young people and asked them what they really thought. Obviously, we had to go back to the drawing board and then start again. And so it was quite an iterative process, which involved a lot of involvement with young people who were already accessing youth services. And from that, we developed ERIC, which in some respects has a real look and feel about it that young people determined. They were the ones really driving how they wanted ERIC to look. I'll give you an example of some of the theoretical kind of contributors to ERIC. We did a lot of research of vulnerable young people in those early days and identified some of the primary mental health difficulties that young people accessing youth services presented with. And there's no surprises, I'm sure, to anybody here that they were primarily anxiety and depression, substance use issues and disordered eating. So we looked at a lot of the literature around this, and we asked ourselves a really clear question that our practitioners kept coming to us, which is if we've only got a really small period of time with a young person, if they only access our service for a short period of time, what should we prioritise and what should we focus on when we're trying to build skills and work with them to develop good psychological strategies? And those sort of questions were quite pragmatic questions that we asked of the literature. And we used a lot of research that was asking, what's the best use of practitioner time in reducing the suffering of vulnerable young people? One of the findings was that in actual fact, maladaptive emotion regulation strategies, so strategies that don't serve you well in the regulation of your feelings, are far more harmful for young people's mental health and well-being than us spending time building adaptive strategies. So what that actually looks like, from a theoretical perspective, is this understanding that we've got adaptive strategies that regulate our emotions, and we've got unhelpful or maladaptive strategies. And most young people and most adults actually present with a whole repertoire of strategies that they engage in to manage uncomfortable feelings and emotions. And what we understand from this sort of literature is that reappraisal, which is really changing how you think about a situation so that you can change how you feel, and acceptance, which is based around mindfulness-based principles, only have a really small impact on suffering or on outcomes that mean something to young people. Problem solving has a pretty big impact. So if you're going to target anything, really hone in on problem solving, skill building. Even more interesting to us was this idea that if we could actually reduce maladaptive strategy use, that was associated with, better outcomes for young people. Their profiles of emotion regulation were associated with less psychopathology if they had less maladaptive strategies. And another thing we found was that if they actually had more than one strategy, the more strategies that they used, meaning the broader and richer their repertoire of emotion regulation strategies, then fundamentally the less psychopathology they were demonstrating. So these sort of early studies that we did of vulnerable young people really drove how ERIC was developed. Some people might not be interested in this, but in some ways it's the reason why I'm giving you a little snapshot of this development process is because when you see ERIC, it's quite a simple package. And most people think when they see ERIC, this is what I already do, which is what we love about ERIC. It's not anything that's asking you to do anything different in your practice. It's just that the empirical and the theoretical kind of underpinnings to it are quite robust and sound. And the development of ERIC was done with young people and with youth practitioners. So it should sort of fit with your practice in many ways in a quite seamless way. An example of an ERIC sort of clinical tool is this type of pyramid, which takes this very dry sort of theoretical and empirical information and just puts it in a really simple way for practitioners and young people to understand that we all need a repertoire of emotion regulation strategies to help us manage strong feelings, and that realistically, some of our strategies we use at times, such as avoidance and suppression, yes, they're maladaptive, but as long as they're just used sometimes, they sort of are part of our repertoire. But if we could build our repertoire to grow more of these often strategies, more of these strategies which are considered to be adaptive, then that's great too. But those sometimes strategies are things that might get into a bit of a habit for young people. And if they don't really understand the harmful nature of some of these strategies, they might not be working to reduce their use of them. So simple things like this sometimes often pyramid are ways of communicating how all of these strategies form a repertoire as a whole, and it's really nice to have a choice depending on a different context and situation. Other sort of resources that sit with ERIC is actually a way of conceptualizing emotion regulation in relation to our broader case management models. ERIC is for young adults, so really looking at those life stages from early adolescence all the way through to young adulthood. It's a package that's really promoting social and emotional development during this critical life stage. It has been used for adults and for younger children, but it's really designed for people transitioning from adolescence into young adulthood. And that's because we realised there was a massive gap in our understanding and interventions around this particular age range. Early adolescence and adulthood, we have a lot of empirical kind of knowledge around what works for reducing anxiety and depression and disordered eating and substance use. But for this age range, it's a bit of a challenge. And so that's the age range ERIC is for. This case model is a way of understanding all the different elements of ERIC, of how they work together and how they interact to create a repertoire of good emotion regulation and impulse control. And that in many respects, by being able to have those skills in good regulation, in good impulse control, it can really mean that you can interact in a really protective way with other relationships. And you can participate in education, you can participate in employment and training, and fundamentally, have a connection to your community. And that all of these are not one or the other. They are absolutely essential for healthy development. It's not about developing an emotion regulation strategy in the absence of understanding the young person as a whole, and really having this very person-centered approach to how we promote good, healthy developmental outcomes for young people who are really, really vulnerable. This is a look at ERIC, and I'll flick through this quite quickly before I get on to describing the project. So ERIC is made up of 8 domains, and it comes from that process I've sort of touched on in terms of how we've developed it. these are the 8 domains. They're all colour-coded. All of the resources that sit with Eric are matched to a different domain. And when we talk about Eric being modular, this is what we mean. We mean that if you are working with a young person who really needs to develop some emotion regulation skills in one domain, then it's quite easy just to pull that one module out of Eric and to work with the young person in that way. Each domain has 3 of these sort of mission statements, or 3 of these objectives associated with them. So for example, the yellow domain, which is called reducing vulnerability, is really targeting those maladaptive strategies that I highlighted earlier. And it's that kind of question I put earlier, which is if you've got nothing else that you have time to focus on in terms of building skills in emotion regulation, focus on this, focus on reducing the use of maladaptive strategies, because our theoretical and empirical literature tells us that that's really, really important for distress. It's really important for symptoms of anxiety and depression and disordered eating. And it's really important in terms of just general well-being and overall quality of life. So reducing maladaptive strategies of emotion regulation is this reducing vulnerability module. So an aim for this module is to reduce rumination and suppression. And that just might be enough of a focus for a practitioner working with a vulnerable young person. Eric can also be applied as a whole program, which a lot of services have implemented. And this is an example of a way of approaching Eric as a whole. And it might be actually sitting with a young person and working through their Eric targets in a way that identifies what it is that that young person individually in their repertoire of emotion regulation strategies would benefit from working on. So if they are excellent at problem solving, then you might prioritise and focus on emotional literacy. If emotional literacy is something that a young person would really benefit from, then you might do that alongside one of the other modules and do them in tandem. And as you work through each of these modules, you might ask the young person to reflect through my ERIC targets and work out, what is it that you want to work on, and what of your emotion regulation skills and strategies would benefit you. Reducing vulnerability is something I've already spoken a little bit to. It's yellow, and these are the types of things that ERIC resources look like. They're quite brightly coloured. They've got an element of psychoeducation involved in them. They also have quite a practical focus. When we worked with the young people who are in residential rehab about what ERIC should look like and what types of things should be included in ERIC, they wanted to cut to the chase. They wanted something in one page. They didn't want a 50-minute session. They didn't want to sit through groups. They didn't want someone talking to them in a really long, lengthy kind of psychoeducation sort of process that they were used to in doing group treatments, or that they were used to in talking with their counsellors. They wanted something really short, sharp and simple. And so all of the ERIC strategies can be delivered in about 5 to 7 minutes. So they can just sort of sit in an interaction. We've had practitioners deliver ERIC who are outreach practitioners driving young people to appointments. We've had ERIC delivered in drop-in centres. We've had ERIC delivered in natural conversations where these types of resources are never even pulled out. But it's really just asking practitioners to, as part of their therapeutic work, focus on building emotion regulation skills in young people, particularly young people who have a history of early childhood trauma or disruption to their attachment, child protection involvement, particularly young people who are demonstrating those types of signs that tell you that they are struggling to control their feelings, struggling to control their behaviours, and it's not really serving them. So ERIC looks a little bit like this, and these sort of worksheets are consistent throughout ERIC. Emotional literacy really is about identifying and naming emotions and building that real gateway skill for being able to manage emotions by firstly identifying emotions accurately in the first place. Not describing emotions as just generally shit, describing a specific emotion such as feeling fearful. These are the types of things that we ask young people to sort of reflect on, all the different elements of emotions as they build their understanding of their own sort of internal thoughts, their own urges, their own body signals associated with emotions, the behaviours that they engage in when they feel certain ways. Another of the ERIC modules is flexible thinking. This is that cognitive reappraisal that we sort of highlighted earlier as one of those adaptive strategies. This is really the basis of most of our cognitive behavioural interventions. And most of this stuff would look very familiar to you because ERIC is a cognitive and behavioural package. It's, in lay terms, a little bit like adapted DBT. It's a DBT program in many respects that has been modularised, adapted and made into micro skills. So rather than signing up to a full DBT program where young people might have to commit to a series of groups over a series of months, ERIC is something that's really a micro skill focus. We think that any skill's better than none, and you can acquire a skill in a really short period of time and practice it. And like all complex skills, emotion regulation is a really complex skill. It requires a lot of coaching. It requires a lot of careful encouragement. It requires lots of practice and trial and error. And also you need a little bit of luck in there as well so that you kind of happen across one of those strategies that works for you. Flexible thinking is really asking young people to put themselves in someone else's shoes. And as you can see, all of these resources are really colourful, and the young people really sort of chose how they wanted ERIC to look. One of the things you might notice when I'm showing you these types of resources is that there's a practice and reflect section on all of the ERIC resources. And it's really encouraging young people to try to build ERIC skills into their everyday, not just when they're talking to their worker, not just when they're attending counselling. Allowing is an ERIC module, which is really about accepting yourself and others. And it's a very difficult skill, but a super important skill when it comes to being able to regulate emotions. It's based around some principles on self-compassion, as well as the ability to be able to observe thoughts and emotions without sort of immediately jumping in and trying to change them. And this idea of allowing emotions to be as they are without trying to change them is a really challenging skill for adolescents and young people to learn. But it's a foundational principle for emotion regulation. And it's the opposite of avoidance. And we know avoidance is one of those really clear maladaptive strategies that doesn't serve people well in emotion regulation. So an example of an allowing sort of skill is around surfing emotions and allowing space for all of your feelings, and really being able to identify emotions, identify which emotions that a young person might struggle against, and then make a commitment to allow that emotion for a period of time, even if it's just 30 seconds. Micro mindfulness is something that kind of came about from working with a lot of the young people who gave us feedback in the early days of developing ERIC, and that they had been exposed to a lot of meditation through their contact with services. And they found meditation really difficult, super challenging for them to even understand why they might be engaging in meditation, and also something that they struggled to implement in their day to day. It was okay when they were at Resi Rehab, but when they had someone external coming in and facilitating meditation, but it wasn't something they could do in their day-to-day life. So micro mindfulness is taking an element of mindfulness and really making it incredibly simple and highlighting more the focus on grounding and observing body signals as a way of addressing overwhelming emotions, for example. So this is an example of a micro mindfulness strategy, which is a mindful lean, and it's about asking young people to pay attention to certain parts of their body for a period of time so that they can bring their awareness back into their body. And the lean is something that a lot of kids kind of, got pretty quickly. And that lean was something that you could do when you're waiting in line at Centrelink, when you're waiting in line at the GP, when you were, just frustrated with general, I guess, service engagement. Equally, it might be something that you could do at home. We kind of liken micro-mindfulness to things like brushing your teeth every morning, rather than it being a distress tolerance skill that you might implement when you are really aroused, or something that you might just practice every single day, so that you just get into the habit of checking in with the present moment. Tolerating discomfort, on the other hand, was one of those skills about really fundamentally being able to resist that urge to engage in unhelpful behaviours when aroused, when triggered, and to use distraction and self-comfort really purposefully, so that young people get a sense of how they can get control over some of their really unhelpful ways of responding to distress. If their ways of responding to distress make things worse, it might be engaging in non-suicidal self-injury, it might be binge use of alcohol and drugs, it might be becoming argumentative, picking a fight. These types of unhelpful strategies increase young people's challenges. And so the tolerating discomfort is very much about kind of emergency skills when you're in a really tough situation, about how not to make it worse. So yeah, we call it tolerating a bad situation with distraction without making it worse. And as you can see, lots of ERIC resources have like these boxes in there, and they're kind of an opportunity for a practitioner to work with a young person to build their own personalised plan, their own personalised, in this instance, distraction plan. So rather than this broad general list of distraction techniques, why don't you hold ice, why don't you have a bath, why don't you go for a run, this is very much a resource which personalises that for the young person, so that they themselves get a sense of agency over what works for them for distraction. Decision making is problem solving, but it sort of incorporates a bit of emotional sort of management as well. So there's a little bit of grounding prior to engaging in problem solving, because as we know, young people find it quite challenging to problem solve when they're already emotionally aroused. So all of the emotion regulation strategies in ERIC are really fundamentally for young people, adolescents, adults who are struggling with controlling their emotions. And so problem solving doesn't really work when you're very, very distressed. Your brain goes blank, you're very aroused, you just want to escape the situation. You're not able to switch into problem solving mode. So switching on your decision-making brain is one of the strategies in ERIC that help young people deregulate first in terms of just that arousal, so that they can switch into problem solving. And it's being really procedural for them and articulating exactly why that's important before they can engage in problem solving. And the last module of ERIC is about identity and values. And this is, of course, very important for young people who are beginning to form their own identity through adolescence and young adulthood, and to just know what their personal strengths and their personal values are, so that they are aware of what motivates them, so that they know what gives them a purpose in their life. And this is what the identity and values sort of resources look like. So that's a very quick snapshot of ERIC. We usually run through that in a 2-day workshop. So that's just giving you a real taster of it. And I want to spend the rest of the time just really talking about the project itself, and then we'll have obviously a chance for Q&A with our panel. The objectives of this particular project were twofold. We really wanted to look at the impact of ERIC on young people's social and emotional outcomes. We're interested in what their mental health outcomes were and the alcohol and drug use was. And the young people that we recruited into this project were what we would consider quite vulnerable young people with multiple and complex needs. They were all accessing youth drug and alcohol services. The second sort of objective of the project was to determine, how feasible is it to implement ERIC across youth drug treatment. And so we did a lot of interviewing of practitioners. We examined our implementation sort of strategies a lot, and we were really looking at the barriers and the facilitators to how to implement packages like Eric, not just Eric, but programs like Eric in our sector. These are the specific aims. As you can see, we kind of broke social and emotional outcomes down to things that were quite observable behaviours. We wanted to look at their quality of life, and that was both practitioner rated as well as young person rated, psychological wellbeing, their social support, their school environment. We wanted to look at their engagement in school and extracurricular activities, those kind of factors in the Eric case model, which were those outer rings, those yellow outer rings that determine very much our social and emotional functioning. We also obviously were interested in mental health outcomes and emotion regulation outcomes like depression and anxiety and stress, as well as difficulties regulating emotion. We looked at substance use and then those practicality and feasibility questions. The findings are, they're written in an enormous report that, as I said, was a 3.5-year project. So I'm just going to pull out some of the findings, and really happy at the end of this presentation if people want to reach out to find out more about some of the findings, to share some broader outcomes for you. But these are the couple of findings of the project that I thought might be of interest. The first finding that we have knowledge of, obviously anecdotally, but just to confirm, was the complexity of our service users. The young people who engaged in our study, it was quite an inclusive study, so our inclusion criteria was very broad. We didn't want to conduct a study which excluded young people who Eric is designed for, because they were too distressed, or because they didn't have stable housing, or because we couldn't get parental consent. We wanted to include young people in the study who are representative of the people that we see within our services. As you can see, their socio-demographic characteristics were as we would expect. There was a high representation of minority groups. We had more than half who had a history of involvement with the criminal justice system. Nearly half had experienced homelessness in their lifetime, and 41% had completed year 10. So we can see that we have representation from minority groups in our sample, and this is really important to us to ensure that we're capturing exactly the vulnerabilities of the young people who are accessing youth services. The mental health characteristics, anecdotally we knew, but it really was still, I think, a little bit surprising to see the degree of complexity of our young people. More than 50% had been diagnosed with mood and anxiety disorders, which is not a surprise. But what was interesting was that the vast majority had more than one mental health diagnosis, and in actual fact had 2 or more mental health diagnoses. So we're getting a sense of this sort of age range, which we know from the literature is that there is diagnostic instability, which means that there's quite a lot of mental health distress, and there's a lot of symptoms of mental health issues that are evident in young service users that don't necessarily fit neat sort of diagnostic categories. And the complexity of that picture can be quite challenging when trying to implement programs for the treatment of mental health disorders or reducing symptoms for mental health issues and challenges because of this picture. But this is the norm within our sector. And so one of the things that we're very strong on with Eric is that it's transdiagnostic. It's not an evidence-based package for anxiety. It's not an evidence-based package for cannabis use. It's a package that should actually apply for any young person who is presenting at a youth service. We have some issues, obviously, within our young people as part of this study that were quite alarming, and that was just the number of young people who engaged in our study who had attempted suicide and who had engaged in self-harm in their lifetime. And this was a significant finding, and it's very, very concerning. The alcohol and drug characteristics of this group will be of no surprises to anybody on the call. Obviously, cannabis and stimulants and alcohol are our most common substances of harm. And of course, the vast majority, nearly half had used multiple substances, and the vast majority had used tobacco. Another key finding that I wanted to sort of pull out was the impact of ERIC. Some of the findings that we were really interested in was just what are the impacts of ERIC on young people's quality of life. In this study, ERIC was delivered alongside usual care, alongside treatment as usual. In some instances, that was counselling. In other instances, that was case management. In other instances, that was, access to a vocational program. It might have been access to a cooking group. It might be a drop-in service. So the real world applicability of this research was one of the things that I guess was a significant challenge. So if we consider ERIC alongside treatment as usual, we found that there was some improvements in quality of life more around that psychological wellbeing. We also had key findings around the social and emotional health of young people. Obviously, our hope was that engagement in pro-social activities would be a real target for ERIC, and we found no difference in engagement in pro-social activities. Pro-social engagement is really defined in our study as around, accessing the outer ring of that ERIC case model, which might even be attending treatment regularly. It might be engaging in education. It might be engaging in activities around vocational development. It might just be attending court or adhering to a treatment order. So some of the things that we were really interested in is those quite observable outcomes. Extracurricular engagement did actually improve really mildly, as well as this sort of social life of engagement in peer engagement. But one of the things that was very evident to the research team is that ERIC was something that we think from our piloting programs has the most significant impact when it's delivered probably a minimum of 12 to 16 skill building opportunities, meaning if a young person is accessing a service over a 3-month period, which was the length of this program, of this project, if they're accessing that service weekly or even twice weekly, the opportunity for ERIC to make a real impact is through that micro skill building, that repeated practice, that coaching, that ongoing touch point with their worker to build and reiterate those skills. Unfortunately, what we found is that a significant barrier for accessing the ERIC program was just how infrequently young people accessed their service, how infrequently young people touched base with their workers and their AOD practitioners. And so there was a significant observation of the research team in just needing a greater impact, greater adherence for young people, meaning that we just wanted them to have more involvement with therapeutic services for there to be an even, larger opportunity for them to have changes. In spite of that, we still had findings that gave us hope that even with the cursory touch points that young people had with their services, there were still changes. Some key findings around some mental health symptomatology were in line with all of our other ERIC outcome research, which has shown that, we had reductions in anxiety and depression and stress. And we found that there was a very, very, mild but significant improvement in emotion regulation. Alcohol and other drug use was something we don't necessarily specifically target with Eric, but everyone was accessing youth drug treatment services. And so there was some reduction in cannabis and amphetamine use in the cohort. And again, I think the takeaway for me around these key findings was that there was change in young people in spite of maybe only accessing services 3 times during the research trial. So finally, the last sort of section of findings are really around our service system. And one of the things that we determined is that a simplified training model probably wasn't going to cut through in terms of uptake of packages like Eric. And that even though we made the resources and the worksheets and all of the, all of the materials broadly available, and they are available on a website for you to all access as well. We felt that the best way to really implement Eric within services was to target and overcome some of the barriers that we encountered when we were training teams and training individuals in Eric. And we found that service values and team culture was a really, really interesting determinant of whether the team had an enthusiasm for really building skills in young people, sort of what I would call as having an agenda for change as they worked with young people. The team cultures that were more accustomed to building skills in young people, no surprises, found it pretty easy and seamless to implement Eric because Eric is a skill building package. And that our practitioner knowledge about evidence-based practice didn't change over time. It was something that most of the practitioners held in high regard, and then at the end of the program they held in high regard the use of evidence-based practice. So it's really not necessarily just the attitudes of practitioners or the training model that would determine whether a service really implements a package like Eric. It was about the team culture and the values of the team as a whole, about being really focused on skill building and outcomes of young people and really building social and emotional outcomes and improvement in health in young people. As well as our challenges in retaining young people in services, we actually had a really similar challenge in retaining practitioners in the program. And so one of the things that we wanted to highlight, I guess it's just no surprise to anyone on the call, is just how many competing demands there are as a practitioner and how challenging it is to fit in professional development opportunities. And that really foundational, pillars of best practice are things that practitioners find it really hard to implement into their practice because they are so busy with crises. Many of our practitioner recommendations are about really targeting depression and anxiety and trauma-related symptoms in our practice in AOD, and making sure that we have really clear ways of reducing self-harm and suicidal ideation and suicidal acts. And this was a significant area of just building competency in risk management, yes, but also risk reduction and suicide prevention, as well as addressing the competencies across the workforce in working with our vulnerable minority groups, our groups who were part of our program and who were overrepresented in terms of their vulnerability, and just making sure that our services and our practitioners are incredibly welcoming, and that the access to service, as we're all very passionate about it, is actually part of our job, not waiting for young people to access our service, and particularly not from vulnerable minority groups. Other recommendations are up for you to read. I'm just running out of time here. So in a very, very quick snapshot, we felt that Eric really filled a gap in our youth AOD services. We felt that the service model, that gap was just really around targeting some of those social and emotional elements that are associated with early childhood trauma, and that while we're approaching things from a trauma-informed care model, Eric was complementary to harm reduction practices. Eric was complementary to trauma-informed care because it specifically targeted the types of skills that young people would benefit from to address some of the sort of consequences of having a significant exposure to trauma during childhood. Other models that we thought were really, really important was just, prioritising skill building interventions that reduced distress in young people, and particularly mental health comorbidities, because it was really, actually our standard presentation, polysubstance use as well as mental health comorbidities, and not just polysubstance use with one mental health issue, but with multiple mental health issues. And the last recommendation is just, trying to elevate in some way our way of coordinating across our systems of care so that there's a unified framework for young people who are accessing youth justice, youth mental health, youth AOD, and coordinating with our education and vocational services and homelessness support services. Our final recommendations were around research to practice, and we had a lot of barriers as researchers, but I'm really happy to talk to anyone about those specifically. And one of our recommendations was just making sure that our services have strong research partners, and that their research partners engage in meaningful relationships with them, as we did with our 3-year partnership with YSS when we were developing Eric. And that realistically, it's very difficult to conduct research with vulnerable young people because of our ethical kind of governance structures don't have representation from youth alcohol and drug people necessarily on ethics boards, and they certainly don't have representation from youth advocates who want to be part of this research. And most of our young people who are part of this research did so willingly, and we're really excited to contribute to potentially the health and wellbeing of other young people accessing services. So that's the end of the formal presentation, and that's my detail, my email address if you'd like to get in contact, and I'll hand back to Jo with apologies that I've run over a little bit for that presentation.
No, thank you so much, Kate, for a really interesting presentation. It's clearly been several years of very hard work, and it's really great to see an evidence-based transdiagnostic intervention designed specifically for young people. And I particularly liked the flexibility that your treatment program provides. I'd like to now invite Adrian, Elise and Tanina to turn on their videos and audio so that we can address some of the questions that have been coming through the Q&A box. Just because I realise you need to leave early, I thought I'd go to you before starting the Q&A questions from the chat function. Are you able to just maybe provide your thoughts on how evidence-based interventions such as Eric would be most effectively integrated into AOD treatment?
Sure. I think in the presentation, Kate actually covered quite a bit of it in explaining the issues around implementation, but I sort of think you need to look at it from a policy and practice lens as well as a service lens, and then step it through. So Kate had mentioned it. Eric links very well with understanding the impact of trauma and trauma-informed care. It also fits really nicely with the focus on person-centered care, which underpins what we do in health at the moment. I think the starting point in terms of policy is looking at how it fits with current policy and the models of care that we're offering at the moment, and if anything needs to change. And in going through the presentation, I think it's fantastic because it's actually does give us a really succinct model of care for targeting adolescents and young people, which in this field we haven't had a lot of focus on. From a service lens, understanding your starting point. So Kate's already spoken about some of the things that they found in the implementation, that the need to look at management, the type of service that's being offered, the culture of the service, and the service readiness to adapt new models of care. And what that means is actually really examining what introducing this model means for not only the clients or the young people, but the service management their current program and the clinicians offering that service. So there's a process of engagement that needs to go on to look at, see if ERIC replaces or aligns with the current program approach and the impact that it will have. Is it a service redesign, for instance, or is it just a retweak of what people are doing? And building a vision with the people who are going to be implementing the model of care and strategies with the team to introduce and monitor. It's critical that any new program is resourced, so you need to build in training, supervision and evaluation from the beginning. And the aim, I guess, is to really build the capability of the workforce to adapt the program into practice. So from an implementation point of view, I think monitoring the effectiveness from the client, clinician and service perspectives, linking with others who are implementing the programs, so creating a bit of a community of practice, or I know Kate mentioned the idea of having champions and getting those people to connect with one another so they can share their learnings. And I think from a management point of view, just being prepared to be flexible and responsive to issues as they arise, and really looking at trying to problem solve, as you go along. So for any evidence-based practice, I think there's sort of key principles, but I think in relationship to this, you've done a lot of work. So unifying that work with people who are working in the sector is a great way to go.
Thank you very much, Tanina. And just on that point of training, Kate, for any services out there that want to, take up the ERIC intervention, is training available?
Absolutely, yeah. We're obviously in COVID normal training development, if that makes sense. And so online training is something that we're needing to develop and scope. And we've also got a co-design process that we've done with some services as well, which is where the ERIC framework and an emotion regulation framework has been reimagined and reworked for the service itself. An example has been some work we've done with residential settings in out-of-home care who potentially have not been able to formally implement ERIC as a skill building practice, but it's more been something that has been incorporated into their service model of care so that it's been an emotion regulation framework and core principles that have reiterated, throughout the rotating staff around emotion regulation, skill building, and just micro resources. So instead of the big long ones, that these are very, very small, even more kind of succinct resources for out-of-home care workers to implement. So we've co-designed with services too.
Yeah, Jo, I just also meant to mention looking at sustainable practice as well. So it's all good when you introduce a new program to sort of say, oh, we're going to do this, and we set things up and we've got everybody on board. But you do have staff changes and you do have ongoing things that will interrupt that flow. So having some sort of focus on sustainability is also important.
Thank you. I'm just aware time is getting away from us, so I'll turn now to the Q&A box and see what questions have come in. There's one from Libby Top at Deakin asking, is there an ERIC program online that young people who aren't and don't want to be engaged with services could access? So young people not in treatment, could they access ERIC online?
I'll throw that one to Elise because I think she must have answered this consistently throughout the program that we ran. It was certainly a question that came up a lot.
No, as of yet, there is not an online ERIC program. I think the biggest question we got asked by clinicians was, where's the ERIC app? When can I get the ERIC app? Can I give the ERIC app? So no, not at the moment. There's no online ERIC at the moment.
Do you see this in your future?
I think it's probably a different approach now because of COVID, and it's certainly something that I think we'll look into. But yeah, I mean, these things are pretty resource intensive to develop. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now, lots of praise for the presentation. Sorry, I just scroll down here. Someone's just asking, is the program still available? And if so, how does the service access education and training. So that's through the ERIC webpage that you listed, I presume, Kate?
Yes.
At the end of your...
Yep.
Could we use these resources during the counselling sessions with clients? Are there any copyright issues?
Yeah, ERIC is a copyrighted package, but of course it's made to be disseminated through youth services. So the copyright itself is just about whether you sell it to someone else. So of course you can use it.
Fabulous. I don't think there are any other questions listed there. I was just wondering, Kate, in terms of if someone wants to learn more about the evidence base behind ERIC, again, is that the website, the ERIC webpage that you go to for that? Or
yeah, absolutely. We've got obviously this program of work is just about to be written up, and so Adrian and Elise and I and some of the chief investigators have the first of the publications that have just been submitted for publication, and I'm happy to share those once we get them under review. We've also got a series of publications that I think are on the website. Elise, you might have a bit more of an idea about. I mean, I'm sure we're happy to share any publications that have come out.
Absolutely happy to send them through.
Fabulous. And Elise, I believe you had quite a lot of contact with services throughout the project.
Yes, I did.
Wondering, do you have any additional observations about what sometimes made it difficult for services to take ERIC on board? I imagine often programs are very full, and
I think it's just the demands on services that already exist, and so adding in that one extra thing to their plate was often just too much. And so unless the whole service was on board and then the managers above just the program managers, it made it really difficult to have an implementation model for ERIC. And another one as well was clinicians that were working by themselves rather than in a team environment often found it difficult as well, unless they had that support and that regular contact with a manager who was also engaged with ERIC.
Okay,
so there was sort of two.
It's a bit like in a school situation where you kind of have to integrate things into a curriculum.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think it's worth remarking the youth services are very heterogeneous across New South Wales, youth drug and alcohol services as well. There has been some expansion in funding for youth services in the last couple of years by New South Wales Health, but still there still is a wide range of organisations, or there are a wide range of organisations that provide services with all of their different histories and backgrounds and philosophies and ways of operating. We're very fortunate here in the Hunter to have a newish youth team, but still it's very different in each setting. And I guess the just reiterating what you've been saying, Kate and Elise and Tanita as well, the organisational sort of framework, philosophy, support for this intervention it doesn't make it second nature that people are chafing at the bit to adopt something that's different or new for a whole lot of reasons. That's a real question. I think there's a lot of promise in this intervention. It's certainly got a very solid theoretical framework, but working out how we get the right dose of intervention to young people and how we can support clinicians to do that, to see if it can give additional benefits beyond the sort of promising results that we've shown so far is a real question.
Well, thank you all very much for participating in this webinar today. It's been a really interesting webinar from my perspective, and obviously from everyone else, from all the good questions that we've received. So once again, thank you to all our panel members, to Kate for such a great presentation, and for everyone online for joining the webinar. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Okay.